Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. This is a hearing on the nominations of Ms. Kimberly Breyer of Virginia to be the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Mr. Kenneth George of Texas to be U.S. Ambassador to the Oriental Republic of Uruguay, and Mr. Joseph Mondello of New York to be the Ambassador to the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We thank you for being here. We thank you for your willingness to serve our country. Before the ranking member and I begin our opening remarks, we have distinguished guests with us who will be introducing one of our nominees, Senator Cornyn of Texas, will be introducing Mr. George, along with Congressman Sessions as well will be introducing him. And then we're also joined by Congressman Peter King, who's here today. Thank you, sir, for coming and for being with us here today. Obviously, I think you're interested in our nominee from New York. So we thank you for coming. And so I guess I'll begin by recognizing Senator Cornyn. I know you've got a busy day ahead.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for coming over here today, and thank you, Senator Cornyn. And thank you, Congressman King, for being here as well in support of your nominee. I guess you're here to be supportive. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah. You got to ask. It's like those weddings. You got to make sure. You still have to ask the question. But we appreciate all of you being here. And today's hearing is opportune. And I know if you need to run. Thank you. Today's hearing is opportune as we focus on the Western Hemisphere. And I thank the ranking member and the chairman for making it a full committee hearing and not just a subcommittee hearing. As everyone knows, the ranking member has a deep interest in the Western Hemisphere and many years of experience in defending democracy, and so I'm grateful to be able to chair this alongside him today. Ms. Breyer, confirmed as the Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, you of course would be shepherding U.S. policies in the Western Hemisphere at a time that I think is as interesting as any in recent memory. As is part of the trend globally, there is a real challenge to democracy. We see the world increasingly being divided into a battle between autocracy and democracy, and our hemisphere is no exception to that. Obviously, Cuba has not had democracy for a very long time. Venezuela has seen its democracy blatantly stolen, and we are all well familiar with the tragedy that has developed there. And lately, Nicaragua is a place that isn't necessarily a model of democracy, but in the last couple of months, the people of Nicaragua have begun to express how strongly they feel about the erosion of democracy there. All of those three continue to bear watching in the months to come, and you will be shepherding administration policy. In addition to that, we have geopolitical competitors and adversaries of the United States continuing to try to engage in the Western Hemisphere. We know that China is bribing and unfairly investing, and I say unfairly because their investments are one-way streets throughout the hemisphere aggressively, stepping into the vacuum that they argue the United States has left behind. The result has been in the short term that at least two countries in this hemisphere have already recognized Taiwan in Panama and the Dominican Republic and open relations with China instead. The long-term implications, of course, are that as part of these investments, quote unquote, that they make in these countries, they demand and push these countries to vote with them in international forums like the United Nations. Russia is in our hemisphere, and it's largely looking for opportunities to create intelligence agreements and basing agreements, and they do this for a number of reasons: to collect on U.S. interests, but also to potentially have influence over governments in the region. And I think that we should be prepared to see and to help our allies counteract any sort of influence campaigns that they might be trying to undertake to undermine democracy in the upcoming elections in numerous countries, including Mexico and Brazil and Colombia this weekend. It's also a region that faces the threat of transnational crime. We've known about that for a long time and the challenges that Colombia has faced. But these record cocaine hauls and the record cocaine production in Colombia, which we've seen over the last few years, has put tremendous strain on our allies in Guatemala and in Honduras. People would be shocked to learn that Costa Rica is now facing a very serious threat. We don't traditionally think of Costa Rica as a place that faces any sort of threat from transnational crime and violence, but they are deeply concerned about the trends there and need our help to get ahead of it. The Dominican Republic and Haiti. Haiti was a place where drug dealers didn't go through for a while because it was too dangerous even for them. But now it is a place where they have somehow, in some way, found the opportunity to traffic through there through the Caribbean basin and, of course, the Dominican Republic as well. But in addition to these challenges, it's also a region that presents us with opportunities. There will be an election this weekend in Colombia. It will be free, it will be democratic, and it will elect a new president. And we don't weigh in on who we prefer in sovereign democracies. Suffice it to say that no matter who is elected, they'll have some differences of opinion, but by and large, Colombia this weekend will not just elect a democratically elected leader, they will also elect someone who will continue to work with the United States. And Colombia, for all of its challenges, remains a success story as to how U.S. engagement can create allies in the region and around the world who become force multipliers. They are contributing greatly, for example, in Honduras, and helping their own forces. From what we've trained them to do, they are now capable enough of going abroad and doing it themselves. There's opportunity, believe it or not, and it's been underreported in Ecuador. It's still not ideal in terms of what we want to see, but its new president over the last year and a half has taken measures to restore more openness, more democracy, and careful outreach towards the United States. But that is an important opening, and we're happy to see that. We hope those trends will continue. Brazil will have elections next year, and there's obviously been a lot of tumult. But the one thing I always point people to is that in Brazil, the rule of law worked. To the extent that leaders are being removed, they're being removed through their courts, not through their armies. And that is a huge development, and hopefully they'll be able to conduct a very successful election early next year. Chile continues to prosper. Argentina's economy faces some challenges, but it's also a country that has moved into a more pro-American direction, but also one which is trying to engage more openly in economic growth. And I recently had the opportunity to be in Peru, which a nation that doesn't get a lot of attention, but it too has successes. Even though it also removed a president for corruption, it did so through the rule of law. Again, not through a military coup or an assassination, but through its system of laws. And Peru, by the way, takes great pride in the role they play in the world, and it's been a productive one in diplomacy. It is a nation that's not a large nation, but it has a deep diplomatic heritage, and it is why the organization, the informal organization that's come together to confront the challenges of Venezuela is called the Lima Group, because they hosted that first meeting that brought that group together. But I will tell you, and everybody here who cares about the Western Hemisphere, including Ms. Breyer and, of course, the ranking member and myself, know the one thing we hear often from our allies in the region is they feel neglected and ignored. They feel like we do not pay enough attention to them. This is not a partisan issue. Multiple administrations have been guilty of that. And understandably, there's incredible threats and challenges in other parts of the world, in Asia, in the Middle East. But the Western Hemisphere is important. Something that would be a 1 in another part of the world would be a 5 or a 10 because it's so close to us and so deeply impacts us. So there's a lot to do, and I hope we'll continue to pay more attention to this region because it's incredibly important. In the context of all that, Mr. George, Uruguay is a strong democracy. It has a growing middle class. They have challenges. While they have condemned the Maduro regime, for example, they've resisted isolating it in the international forums. And I hope, if confirmed, that you will be a voice in continuing to nudge them in the right direction. Democracies should be defending democracies. They've enjoyed strong economic growth over the last 10 years and dramatically decreased the widespread poverty that are seen in some of the other countries in the region. As I said already, they have a large middle class. Their democracy is stable. But they've also drawn the attention of China. While the United States is still the largest trading partner with Latin America, China is closing that gap, and I would say unfairly. They bribe their way into many of these countries in the region, and this opens the door for them to continue to further exert its influence over the region. Mr. Mondello, Trinidad and Tobago is a relatively prosperous democracy, but it also produced more ISIS fighters per capita than any country in the Western Hemisphere. And as ISIS leadership looks to rebuild and reorganize as an insurgency, rather than an organization that holds large swaths of territory, it's imperative that Trinidad and Tobago continue to focus on countering violent extremists and that we help them. As we were talking about earlier in our meeting, there are numerous daily nonstop flights between Trinidad and Tobago and Miami and Kennedy Airport. And so we should care a lot about what's happening there. It's very close to home. Unfortunately, Trinidad also continues to side with the Maduro regime at the OAS, and again, that's making it difficult for concerned democracies throughout the hemisphere to pressure Venezuela to return to constitutional order. And I hope, if confirmed, that you can help us continue to nudge them in the right direction, because once again, democracies should support democracy. Just last month, by the way, Trinidad signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which It's a Chinese mega project that seeks to entangle developing countries in one-sided trade relationships that ultimately lead to Beijing to call the shots. And their participation in this initiative allows China to continue to extend its financial and political influence deep into the Western Hemisphere and yet another country. We have to develop ways to counter that and to point out to our allies in the region how one-sided these Belt and Road initiatives are in other parts of the world and how deeply indebted some countries are left after agreeing to these so-called Chinese gifts that turn out to be not so much of a gift after all. So in closing, I'd say all these positions are going to play an important role in advancing our foreign policy. I want to thank all of you and your families for your commitment to our country and your willingness to serve. Thank you very much. Let me start with Ms. Breyer. You referenced in your opening statement the administration change of policy towards Cuba. It's always a good point to remind people that our goal in Cuba ultimately is the restoration of a democracy. We have an economic model that we would suggest. Uruguay is a good example of what works. But that's for the people of a free Cuba to determine. Our goal is democracy. And the threat to democracy in Cuba has been exacerbated by a government that's trying to transition its way into becoming a long-term, permanent, and accepted fixture as a legitimate government. And one of the ways they're doing that is they have this military-owned holding company named GAESA, G-A-E-S-A, which is basically owns every profitable venture in Cuba. And so they're trying to create an economic dictatorship on top of the political one. And when the president made his change in policy towards Cuba, that's what he really focused on, was hitting that economic activity. So that today, an American traveler to Cuba can frequent these so-called small businesses that are independently owned and the like. And in fact, they're in a privileged position. But theoretically, anyway, under the changes, you're not supposed to be going and spending money at these GAESA-owned entities. As part of that agreement and the executive order, it was left to the State Department to define the companies and the entities that fell under the criteria of being sanctioned. And while I think the list is certainly better than what existed before the executive order, as you and I discussed when we met, the list is incomplete. There are a series of companies and ventures that remain untouched, and as a result have created the ability to circumvent much of the intent of what the president did. And it's unfortunate. We see this pattern repeat, where presidents determine a direction, and then the people who write the regs, the regulations, and the law figure out ways to potentially undermine it, and that needs to be fixed. And so my question is, will you commit to working with us and the administration, including the National Security Council, to amend that list? Obviously, the decision would ultimately be up to the Secretary, but to add to that list additional entities who, as of now, should be on the list but are escaping sanction.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the question. I agree with you wholeheartedly on the direction and on the direction of the President's policy under the NSPM of June of last year. And with regard to the restricted list, that's a collaborative effort between the Department and the Department of Commerce and the Department of Treasury. And I certainly will commit to reviewing it. My understanding is that it's a living document. The initial tranche that was announced last year listed some 180 entities, I believe, and some 83 hotels. And we certainly can continue to review that as new information comes to light.
Thank you. Obviously, the other point in terms of defending democracy in the region is Venezuela. And I do want to say, you know, people can say what they want about other parts of the world. I do think the administration's approach to Venezuela has, quite frankly, been textbook. Interesting that the region is leading. It is the Lima group that we're not even members of, we're supportive of, that are leading the efforts. And you see at the OAS, and I give it's a good opportunity to give a shout out to a friend and someone who I think did a phenomenal job at the latest OAS meeting, Ambassador Carlos Trujillo. We saw additional countries come on board and support us. So my question first to Mr. Mondella and Mr. George is, would you both commit to helping as one of your top priorities, if confirmed, to talk to our ally governments in Trinidad and in Uruguay and urge them to join the rest of the democracies in the region in these efforts at the OAS to call out Venezuela and expel them from an organization of democracies, which is the official administration policy?
Well, this is a very important point, Senator, and I agree. I think it's incumbent upon the ambassador to Trinidad and Tobago, which is only 6.7 miles away from from Venezuela to do all in his power, or her power, to get to be into Venezuela to discuss the various problems that exist and see if that we can bring some stability to what's going on over there. Because right now it's a very unstable situation and it really needs a lot of attention. And frankly, I think that it's something that has to be done and should be done.
Mr. George.
Senator, it's an excellent point, and clearly one of the most sensitive issues politically between the United States and the Oriental Republic of Uruguay. The Uruguayan government has been very helpful in the OAS on a number of occasions, but on the issue of Venezuela, it has been a very tough call. I know how sensitive it is within the government of Uruguay, but I can assure you that it will be one of my principal focuses in regards to my discussions with the government, because it is an important objective of our country and for the peace and security of the region.
Ms. Breyer, we talked about this when we met a few weeks ago, but we are now at a point where we are heavily sanctioning the regime and the individuals responsible for the suffering. But the migratory crisis of Venezuelans leaving, in addition to the humanitarian aspect of it, which is among the worst in the world now. I mean, we're seeing things coming out of Venezuela that we're used to seeing in other parts of the world. We've never seen anything like it in the Western Hemisphere, absent, natural disaster or something of that nature. Isn't just problematic for the people of Venezuela. It poses a real and growing challenge and even threat to their neighbors in Colombia, Brazil, other countries in the region that are taking in these flows. So one of the things we've done is we provided humanitarian assistance and help to Colombia in these camps, which is important. The problem is, the flip side of it is, the more aid is announced to these camps, the more people flow to these camps. Is the administration, in your view, prepared to begin to develop plans to try to figure out how we can deliver humanitarian aid within Venezuela, distributed by non-governmental organizations, and perhaps despite the objection of the Venezuelan government? We cannot allow people to continue to suffer and die, because what we are about to see there, in addition to the starvation and the death from diseases, is the spread of communicable diseases that have been wiped out. And suddenly now we could have measles outbreaks in these countries in the region, which ultimately poses a threat to us as well. So what is, beyond the sanctions, what is, in your view, 2.0? What more can we do to help the people of Venezuela? Because that's an important aspect in all this.
I agree with you, Senator, and share your concern. I think, broadly speaking, the administration's strategy is a broad and deep one, and I appreciate your calling it a textbook, because I do think the administration has gotten it right on Venezuela in what is a tragic situation. I could not agree more. This is a man-made crisis. This is not a natural disaster. This is the result of one man and a small group of people governing in a way that has taken a once prosperous nation and destroyed it. In terms of the administration strategy, we are looking at all aspects of it. I believe our aid to neighboring regions and international institutions is now in the area of $40 million. We're looking at other ways to approach the problem. We certainly need to continue to call on the government of Venezuela to accept humanitarian aid. To this point, the government has refused to do so. And if they fail to do so, there are other avenues that we can pursue, and I don't want to get ahead of decision-making, but there is certainly a lot of thought being given to what we can do to try to get aid into Venezuela, as well as helping our regional allies in Colombia, Brazil, Guyana, and throughout the Caribbean and other places who are absorbing the impact of this.
Just want to clarify, because that's an interest of mine as well, the whole TPS issue. And if I hear you correctly, what you're describing is an internal process in which the State Department opined on the national security elements for purposes of the diplomatic corps. What's the impact it's going to have in Honduras and Haiti and the like? But then there were other parts of this debate outside of the State Department that were viewing it through the migratory or DHS, and ultimately the policy was made because of all these interconnected silos, so to speak.
That's correct.
Is that how you're describing the process?
Yeah, that's correct, Senator. Ultimately, the decision-making authority on this issue rests with the Department of Homeland Security.
Okay, and so the State Department just informed them on that, and that's the that's the process. Right.
Correct. The State Department informed as to whether the underlying conditions that justified the original designation continue to exist.
Right. And that issue, by the way, probably deserves a broader, just the State Department portion of it deserves a broader flushing out in terms of the rationale, because I too believe that it would have a very significant impact on Honduras and Haiti and these countries that we've invested in. So, thank you. We head here for the finish line. I wanted to raise a couple topics. Ms. Breyer, going back to you for a moment. Let's talk about Nicaragua for a moment. You've followed closely events as they've unfolded there. It's my view, and I think the view of many, that government has lost legitimacy and, frankly, its ability to continue to govern under the conditions. And there's been talks with the Catholic Church. Now I hear the government might want to invite in the UN to figure out a way to moderate a way forward. They obviously are not big fans of the OAS. But so that's why they would want to do that. It's my view that they've lost legitimacy, and they're going to struggle to ever be able to govern again. And that probably the only path forward for them is some sort of earlier election than is currently called for, obviously internationally supervised and the like. What they don't have, in my view, is the benefit of time to run the clock on this. Number one, I do think that at some point the administration, in fact, I know, is going to look very closely at using the Global Magnitsky Act and other options to go after individuals who have been violating human rights and are guilty of corruption. Here in Congress, there's a law called the NICA Act, which unfortunately has run into some procedural hurdles, but which I believe, when voted on, would pass overwhelmingly. And then there's an additional factor, which I have strong reason to believe that within the next 60 days or so, Nicaragua is going to face a real currency challenge. Their currency reserves are dwindling rapidly, so they're going to have a banking and/or currency crisis here probably in the next month and a half to two. So all these things are a confluence of events. Could you? And I think it's important for us to explain to the American people why we should care. Obviously, we've already talked about defending democracy in the Hemisphere, and it's why it's in our national interest to do so. Nicaragua also happens to be, perhaps after Cuba, the nation where Russia has the most influence in terms of talking about potential visit rights or even basing rights in the Hemisphere and the like. But the third, which is not often talked about, is the role that Nicaragua plays in terms of the routes that bring drugs, this increased production of cocaine through Central America. And for a lot of different reasons, primarily because they kill drug dealers, they have avoided Nicaragua. If there is instability there of any sort, if it compromises because of an economic crisis, the ability to continue to enforce those mechanisms, that's an additional transit point that would now open up, thereby making it even easier to bring drugs into the United States. How do you view, first of all, kind of where we are today in our policies, and could you describe sort of what you think the appropriate role for the U.S. is in regards to Nicaragua in the months to come?
Thank you, Senator. This is a really important issue that is evolving and breaking as we sit here. I want to go back to something that both you and the ranking member mentioned in your opening statements, which is, by and large, we have a tremendous opportunity in the Western Hemisphere, and we've seen an incredible amount of positive change over recent years. There are glaring exceptions to that, and the glaring exceptions are the countries that follow this old model, the Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua principally, where I think the populations in those countries have said enough, that this model doesn't work, and it is time for a change. And certainly we've seen that recently with Nicaraguans of all stripes in the streets. We've seen students, we've seen business organizations, we've seen the church, and I think people have been struck by the diversity of the number of people protesting and their backgrounds who have told the Ortega government that enough, and it is time to make a change. In terms of the U.S. role, clearly, we're following it very closely. It is a priority. We announced very recently that we are withdrawing visas from some top regime officials for their participation in the suppression of the protests. GLOMAG, as you mentioned, is something that has already been used in Nicaragua, and we could use again, and we'll be looking at, I think, all of the possible tools for addressing this crisis at the same time as pressing the government of Nicaragua to come to the table and resume dialogue under the auspices of the church and the other players to move this toward quick resolution. I agree with your characterization that there is not a tremendous amount of time, and that we're looking at a situation where the government needs to probably move very quickly to schedule elections and move the process forward.
And again, what I'm about to say is my opinion. I'm not representing that to be the opinion of anybody else or the official opinion of the administration, and I'm not asking you to opine on it. You're still not confirmed. But I still think that, contrary to Venezuela, there is still time for Ortega and for his wife, the vice president, to figure out a way to sort of call a new real election and kind of transition to some form of retirement. I've had an opportunity last week to meet with numerous students from Nicaragua. None of them are yet calling for them to be put in jail or them to be even forcibly exiled. I do think there comes a point where you cross a line, and then that sort of opportunity is no longer available. And so I hope it's an opportunity they'll take, because I think the reverse, if something like that does not happen, is there is a real potential for significant bloodshed. We have seen both former Sandinistas and Contras, Sandinistas who oppose Ortega and Contras who always did, who have been threatening to take up arms to rebel against the government. So I do believe that there is the potential, sadly, for a much more violent open confrontation that reminiscent of what we may have seen in some portions of the 80s, and there's a chance to still avoid it, and I hope they're hearing that, and that there is a chance to do that. I wanted to ask one more question, and I actually wanted to ask you, Mr. George, for your input, although it takes you outside of Uruguay, it takes you into sort of some of your business experience. There's reports yesterday, let me just say that there are no U.S. oil sanctions on Venezuela. It's been widely speculated. The only people sanctioning the Venezuelan oil industry is the Maduro regime, because their production has declined, just collapsed. And a consequence of that, and they use the oil, by the way, to buy their influence. When people ask themselves, why are some of these countries out there still voting with them at the OAS, not really Uruguay for these purposes, but others, it's because of oil, through the agreements that they had made in PetroCaribe and the like. But they announced in the last couple of days, it's been brought to light that about half the Caribbean countries are being cut off, because they're being cut off of access to oil because Venezuela can no longer produce it. One of them is not Cuba, by the way. They continue to find ways to deliver. Venezuela still finds ways to deliver humanitarian aid to Cuba after recent events there, but can't deliver humanitarian aid to its own people, and can't produce oil for its other customers, but really reaches to make sure they can continue to provide oil to Cuba. So that's an interesting dynamic. Suffice it to say, Antigua and Barbados, Belize, Dominica, El Salvador, Haiti, Nicaragua, so add to the currency crisis, they're going to lose access to oil. St. Vincent, St. Kitts, all are going to lose access to PetroCaribe oil here very soon because Venezuela can't produce it. My question to you, Ms. Breyer, is there an opportunity there for the United States now to engage with our private sector, not just to make up sort of the loss of energy which these countries need, but ensure that no other potential geopolitical competitor could step in the void and try to fill it at our expense? Because there seems there be an opportunity for us to leverage our U.S. capacity to meet that need, and also has geopolitical benefits. And to you, Mr. George, what is the opportunity, just going off your background and investment in oil and gas and the like, what are the opportunities there for American Gulf refineries to play a role in stepping up and potentially helping to fill that void? It's an unfair question. It's outside the realm of Uruguay, but you're here. I read your bio, and so it sounds like something you might be able to give us some opinions on, but certainly you, Ms. Breyer, I think it's a key opportunity.
Thank you, Senator. I agree with your characterization that the Venezuelan oil sector is collapsing all on its own, absent sanctions from the United States. I think to get to the where we can go in the future in terms of helping Caribbean nations that may be coming off Venezuelan subsidized oil, this is something that the administration has been looking at in cooperation with Canada and Mexico and our partners in the Caribbean to see exactly what you suggest, what opportunities there may be to backfill on supplies. We also have vigorous programs in the Caribbean focused on energy security, looking at alternative forms of energy and ways that the United States, through our development finance and other tools, can assist the Caribbean in getting off of oil entirely and looking at other forms of energy supply. As you well know, the electricity costs in the Caribbean remain very high, so I think we have a challenge there, even absent the PetroCaribe situation.
Senator, it's obviously you're right. It's not in my wheelhouse for today's discussion, but the oil industry is obviously something I've been involved in all my life. My dad was a geologist starting in 1945 in West Texas.
Good time to get into that business.
He was one of those, returnees from World War II, and had a scholarship due to the soldiers and everything. So we wound up in Midland. The issue right now is, yes, we have revolutionized exploration in the world, starting in Texas, in the Barnett Shale with the hydraulic fracking. You don't want me to get into a detailed discussion about what's going on, but I can say the opportunity clearly exists. Now, the Gulf Coast, as you all are obviously very familiar with, those refineries positioned themselves to take heavy crude from the Orinoco Basin in Venezuela, a number of them, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but a significant number. As the crude falls off, as the implosion of the Venezuelan capacity to export, to produce, et cetera, we're having to replace, because you just can't flip a switch and make a refinery change its feedstock. Now, the other problem in regards to responding to your question, because it seems very obvious that you're exactly right, but there are some logistics problems, and not to get into the real details, but we have a significant pipeline constraint. There's going to be no basin in the United States any bigger than the Permian Basin out in West Texas, the Delaware, all those basins that make part of what we call generically the Permian Basin of West Texas. It is multi-stacked. It is going to be prolific. It's going to be one of the largest fields in the entire world. The problem is you got to get it to the market. You got to get it to the refinery. We have now a major constraint. The pipelines are full. So when you have the current market for the product sales, and you have the supply and the pipelines that connect the two, and you can't just put it on a truck. I mean, you can physically put oil on a truck. You cannot do that with natural gas. And you cannot put it necessarily on a rail. You can put it on there, but there's a capacity issue. So the ability to supply that need quickly is an issue that is different from, is it strategically important to the United States that we do it eventually? And as you well remember, we had a major impediment to exporting U.S. energy for a long time in this country. So the ability to sell into the Caribbean has been constrained by other measures. So your point is well taken. I know the oil industry looks forward to being able to create export markets for their product. Nothing is easier than doing it close to home in the Caribbean. I think it is a tremendous opportunity. I have been talking about that concept in other arenas, natural gas into Europe, et cetera, for a long time as a strategic advantage that the United States needs to take advantage of, and we are currently not positioned well to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank all of you for your being here today, and we look forward to continued dialogue on your nominations and confirmations. And so the record of this hearing will remain open until the close of business on Friday. And without objection, the hearing is adjourned.